Could you imagine a time when justice wasn't about what was right, but about who you were, who you knew, and what society expected? What if in a terrifying moment your world was shattered, and instead of finding help you found yourself trapped in a legal system that made no sense? A system where you were the one on trial. What if this wasn't some distant future, but a chilling reality for women back in 940? Number 1. The victim on trial, scrutiny of her character. Imagine a woman, let's call her Elara, living in a small village nestled by a winding river in the heart of what would one day be known as Francia. It is the year 940, at a time when life is hard, but community ties are strong, or so it seems. Elara is known as a diligent spinner, her hands always busy, her reputation unblemished. One evening, returning from a neighboring farm where she had helped with the harvest, Elara was set upon in the fading light of dusk. The assailant, a man from a nearby hamlet, forced himself upon her in the thicket bordering the path. She fought, she cried out, but there was no one to hear, and her struggles were ultimately in vain. When she finally stumbled home, bruised and broken, her clothes torn, her spirit ravaged, her distraught mother and father rushed to her side. In a modern world, we might expect immediate sympathy, immediate concern for her well-being, and a swift pursuit of the perpetrator. But in 940, the immediate aftermath of such an event was often fraught with a different kind of terror for the woman herself. The very first hurdle Elara and her family faced was not the apprehension of the man who had done this, but the looming shadow of judgment from their own community. The concept of honor in the 10th century was a powerful, almost tangible thing, especially for women. A woman's honor was intrinsically linked to her chastity, her virginity, if unmarried, or her fidelity, if wed. When a woman was sexually assaulted, it was not merely a crime against her body or her will. It was often viewed as a stain, a blemish upon her honor, and, by extension, the honor of her entire family. So, when Elara's father, a respected elder in their village, decided to pursue justice for his daughter, the initial steps were not about gathering evidence against the attacker, but often about defending Elara's own reputation. Before any accusation could even be whispered in the ears of the local lord or the community elders, Elara herself would be subjected to an agonizing interrogation, not just by her family, but by those in authority, who would weigh the merits of her claim. They would ask, "Where were you going? Why were you out so late? What were you wearing? Did you say anything to provoke him?" These were not questions asked out of genuine concern for her actions, but rather to determine if she in any way had contributed to her own misfortune. The very act of asking these questions implied a deeply ingrained societal suspicion that a woman might somehow be responsible for the violence inflicted upon her. Historians tell us that in early medieval societies, the concept of a woman's consent, as we understand it today, was largely absent from legal frameworks. Instead, the focus was on the woman's reputation, her status, and whether her honor had been compromised in a way that affected her male guardian's property or social standing. For Elara, this meant her entire life. Her past interactions, her demeanor, everything was suddenly laid bare for inspection. If she had ever been seen speaking too freely with men, if she had ever laughed too loudly, if her family was known to be less than perfectly respectable, these perceived flaws could be weaponized against her. Her tears, her distress, her physical injuries, while undeniable, might be dismissed if her character was deemed questionable by the patriarchal standards of the time. Consider the societal pressure she faced to even speak of such a crime was to risk social ostracization. The very act of accusation could bring further shame upon her and her family. Some families might have preferred to keep the matter quiet, to hide the dishonor, fearing that public knowledge of the assault would make their daughter unmarriageable, forever marked. For Elara's father to go forward, he had to be immensely courageous, ready to withstand the whispers and sidelong glances that would inevitably follow. And even then, the community's initial response would likely be to dissect Elara's character, searching for any hint that she was somehow less than pure, less than deserving of protection. In essence, the woman, the victim, became the initial defendant. Her virginity was paramount if she was unmarried. Her marital fidelity if she was wed. If she was deemed to have been anything less than perfectly chaste or modest, if there was any perception that she had invited the assault, then her claim would be significantly weakened, if not dismissed entirely. This profound societal emphasis on female purity meant that the burden of proof shifted dramatically, placing an impossible weight on the woman to prove her own blamelessness before even beginning to prove the assailant's guilt. Her internal suffering was immense, yet the external gaze of judgment was even more suffocating. This was the first, and perhaps most insidious, of the unfair legal outcomes for women in cases of sexual assault in 940. Add the immediate and unrelenting scrutiny of her very being, effectively putting her on trial simply for having been victimized. Number 2, property not person, the crime against male honor. Let us continue with Elara's story. Her character, after intense scrutiny, was deemed sufficiently virtuous, thanks to her family's strong standing and her own diligent reputation. Her father, finally able to press the accusation, now faced another daunting aspect of 10th century law, the understanding of the crime itself. In 940, and throughout much of early medieval Europe, the legal systems did not primarily view sexual assault as a crime against a woman's bodily autonomy, her right to control her own person. Instead, it was overwhelmingly perceived as a crime against the male head of the household to whom the woman belonged. This meant it was an offense against her father's honor, her husband's reputation, or her brother's family standing. It was a violation of property rights, a trespass against a man's lineage and the value of his female dependents. Imagine Elara's father standing before the local lord's court, attempting to convey the horror of what had happened to his daughter. The language of the law, however, was not equipped to express the violation of Elara's spirit or body. Instead, it focused on the quantifiable loss, the damage to the family's honor, the potential decrease in Elara's marriageability, the disruption of the social order. The monetary compensation sought, often called a wergild in Germanic legal traditions or a similar payment in other early medieval codes, was not typically intended for Elara herself. It was for her father, as the guardian of her honor and her economic value. This payment represented restitution for the harm done to his property and reputation, not for the profound suffering endured by his daughter. Consider the implications of this legal framework. If a man stole a cow, he would be punished, and the owner would receive compensation for the stolen animal. In a profoundly disturbing parallel, if a man sexually assaulted a woman, he would be punished, and her male guardian would receive compensation for the damaged property or the dishonor inflicted upon his household. This legal treatment stripped the woman of her individual personhood within the legal system, reducing her to an appendage of her male relatives. Her pain, her trauma, her personal violation were secondary to the male, economic or social loss. For Elara, this meant that even if her assailant was found guilty, any monetary or material recompense would bypass her entirely. It would be given to her father, who was seen as the injured party in the eyes of the law. While her father might use some of these resources to support Elara or help her, the legal principle itself underscored her lack of independent standing and the systemic devaluation of her personal suffering. It meant that her voice, her experience, her injury were not seen as central to the crime. The central injury was to the male family line, to the social order, and to the property rights of the male head. Scholarly works on 10th century legal systems describe how punishments for sexual assault often varied depending on the social status of both the assailant and the victim's male guardian, rather than the severity of the act itself or the impact on the woman. If the assailant was a powerful lord, or if the victim's guardian was of low status, the wergild might be less, or the justice might be perverted by influence and power. This further highlights how the crime was viewed through a lens of social hierarchy and male property rights, not individual rights. Consequences of this perspective rippled through every aspect of the legal process. It affected how the crime was investigated, if at all, how seriously it was taken, and what the ultimate resolution would be. It shaped societal attitudes, reinforcing the idea that women were possessions, valuable for their lineage, their labor, and their ability to bear legitimate heirs, rather than as autonomous beings with inherent rights to bodily integrity. For Elara, navigating such a system meant that her profound personal violation was overshadowed by the broader societal and legal preoccupation with male honor and property. The legal system, in its very structure, told her that what happened to her was primarily a problem for her father, not for her. Number 3, no voice of her own. Lack of independent legal standing. Elara's case, despite the initial scrutiny of her character and the legal framing of the crime as one against her father's honor, proceeded to the next stage. But as she stood, metaphorically speaking, in the village assembly or the Lord's hall, she found herself in a position of profound powerlessness. She could not, as an independent woman, bring charges herself. She could not directly address the Lord or the assembly to demand justice for herself. In 940 women, regardless of their social standing, generally lacked independent legal standing. This meant they could not initiate legal proceedings, represent themselves in court, or even speak directly on their own behalf in most legal matters. Imagine Elara, filled with righteous anger and deep pain, wanting to confront her attacker, to tell her story with her own words, to demand accountability. But the law did not allow it. Instead, her father, or in some cases her husband or a male relative, had to act as her legal representative, her Mundwald or guardian. It was his voice that spoke her truth, his arguments that pressed her case, his authority that gave her claim any legal weight. If Elara's father had been unwilling to pursue the case, perhaps out of fear of retaliation, or concern for the family's standing, or simply a lack of belief in his daughter's story, Elara would have had no recourse whatsoever. Her fate would have been entirely in his hands, subject to his will and his judgment. Historians and legal scholars describe how women in early medieval Europe were almost universally considered to be in a state of perpetual legal minority, akin to children regardless of their age. They were under the legal guardianship, or mundium, of their fathers, then their husbands, and if widowed, often their sons or other male relatives. This guardianship was not merely a protective measure. It was a legal and social framework that limited a woman's autonomy in virtually every sphere of life, including legal affairs. She could not enter into contracts, inherit property without male oversight, or bring lawsuits. Her legal identity was subsumed within that of her male guardian. For Elara, this meant that her intense personal experience of the assault was filtered through her father's interpretation, his ability to articulate her suffering, and his willingness to risk his own social standing. While her father undoubtedly loved her and wanted justice, his legal persona was primary, not hers. He might interpret her feelings differently, or focus on aspects of the case that were most strategically beneficial to the family's reputation or economic standing, rather than directly addressing Elara's personal violation. His motivations, while perhaps well-intentioned, could diverge from her own desires for justice or closure. Consider a scenario where the male guardian might have a conflict of interest. Perhaps the assailant was a powerful neighbor with whom the guardian had important economic ties, or perhaps the guardian himself was reluctant to stir up trouble in the community. In such cases, the victim would be completely at the mercy of her guardian's decision. She could choose not to pursue the case, or to settle it privately in a way that offered her no personal justice, perhaps even coercing her into a forced marriage with her assailant to mend the damage. As we will explore further, Elara would have no legal avenue to challenge his decision, no way to independently seek redress. This fundamental lack of independent legal standing created an almost insurmountable barrier for women seeking justice for sexual assault. It meant that the victim's agency was entirely removed from the legal process. Her voice, her truth, her desire for accountability were secondary to the male guardian's position, his power, and his interpretation of the family's best interests. It created a system where women were reliant on the goodwill and proactive intervention of men for any hope of legal redress, even in cases of grave personal harm. Elara's suffering was hers alone, but the path to justice was firmly controlled by others. Number 4. The ordeal of justice through divine intervention. As Elara's father continued to press the case against her alleged assailant, the legal process in 940 AD would often pivot to methods of determining guilt that strike us today as bizarre and deeply unfair. With no forensic science, no detailed investigative procedures, and often no reliable witnesses to a crime committed in secret, early medieval courts frequently resorted to what were known as trials by ordeal, or compurgation. These methods were not based on gathering evidence, but on the belief in divine intervention or the power of sworn oaths. Imagine the tension in the village assembly. The alleged assailant, a man named Hrothgar, perhaps stoutly denying Elara's accusations, or perhaps even casting aspersions on her character. With conflicting testimonies and no clear way to ascertain the truth through rational inquiry, the community leaders, often guided by the local lord or a priest, would propose an ordeal. Perhaps Hrothgar would be forced to undergo the ordeal of hot iron, where he would carry a heated piece of metal for a certain distance, and his hand would then be bandaged. After 3 days, if the wound was clean and healing, he was deemed innocent, the divine judgment having affirmed his truth. If the wound was festering, he was guilty. Or perhaps it would be the ordeal of cold water, where he would be bound and thrown into consecrated water. If he sank, he was innocent. If he floated, the water, being pure, had rejected him as impure, marking him guilty. For Elara and her father, this was a terrifying prospect. Their pursuit of justice now rested not on their compelling testimony or the evidence of her injuries, but on a superstitious belief in God's direct intervention. The outcome of the ordeal was entirely arbitrary, influenced by factors like the skill of the person bandaging the wound, the temperature of the water, or simply random chance. Yet, in the minds of the people of 940, this was seen as a legitimate way to ascertain truth, a divine judgment when human judgment failed. The very idea that her attacker's guilt or innocence would be decided by whether his hand healed cleanly or whether he sank in a pond must have been a crushing blow to Elara's hope for real justice. Beyond physical ordeals, another common method was compurgation or trial by oath helpers. In this scenario, the accused Hrothgar would not directly prove his innocence, but would bring a number of respected men from the community, his oath helpers or compurgators, to swear an oath that they believed him to be innocent. They were not swearing to the facts of the case, but to their belief in his character and the truth of his denial. The number of oath helpers required varied, but it could be as many as a dozen. Problem for Elara was that this system heavily favored those with good social standing, strong family ties, and influence within the community. If Hrothgar was a well-connected man with many male relatives and friends willing to swear for him, his guilt or innocence would be determined by their collective reputation, not by the facts of the assault. For Elara, this meant that the pursuit of justice was deeply flawed. She, as the accuser, could not bring oath helpers to swear to her truth. Her word, even backed by her father, might be considered insufficient against the collective oaths of powerful men. The system inherently favored the accused, especially if they were well regarded in the community, and left the victim with no true means of proving her case beyond her often unsupported testimony. The emotional toll of this must have been immense. To have suffered such a violation, and then to have her quest for justice hinge on a random act of God or the social network of her assailant, was profoundly demoralizing. Historians studying early medieval legal practices often point to the widespread use of ordeals and compurgation as a reflection of societies that lacked sophisticated investigative techniques and relied heavily on religious belief and community pressure to maintain order. While these methods served a purpose in preventing endless feuds and resolving disputes in a time of limited state power, they were inherently unfair to those, like Elara, who sought justice for crimes committed in secrecy, where concrete evidence was scarce, and where the victim's word alone was often insufficient. The justice, meted out through these means, was often an arbitrary, dehumanizing mockery of true accountability. Number 5. Forced marriage as redress. Elara's case, after navigating the perils of character scrutiny, the property-focused legal framing, her lack of independent standing, and the arbitrary nature of ordeal or compurgation, might culminate in a horrifying solution. In many early medieval societies, if a man was found guilty of sexual assault, especially if the victim was unmarried and her virginity was compromised, a common form of redress was for the assailant to be compelled to marry his victim. This was not about personal choice or love, but about restoring the woman's honor and the family's social standing in the most pragmatic way possible. Imagine Elara, traumatized and violated, now faced with the prospect of being bound for life to the very man who inflicted such pain upon her. This marriage was not a gesture of compassion or true justice. It was a grim calculation to mitigate the perceived damage. A woman who had been sexually assaulted, particularly if she was unmarried, was often considered unmarriageable in the eyes of society. Her dishonor made it difficult for her family to arrange a respectable marriage for her, affecting her prospects and their lineage. By forcing the assailant to marry her, the legal system aimed to cover up the shame, to provide her with a husband and legitimate children, and to, in a twisted sense, make her whole again in the eyes of the community. This deeply unsettling practice underscored several fundamental injustices. Firstly, it utterly disregarded the woman's feelings, her trauma, and her agency. Her desires, her repulsion, her hatred for her assailant were completely irrelevant. Their personal well-being was secondary to the perceived need to restore her social status and her family's honor. She became a pawn in a grim legal chess game, her future dictated by the perpetrator's actions and society's rigid expectations. Secondly, it fundamentally conflated sexual assault with a breach of promise or a damaged goods scenario. Instead of focusing on the assailant's criminal act, the legal system focused on the resulting damage to the woman's marital prospects. The forced marriage was a way to fix this damage, reducing a heinous crime to a problem of social economics and lineage. It meant that the assailant, rather than facing severe punishment like banishment or physical mutilation, though these also occurred, might simply be forced into a domestic arrangement, albeit one he might not have wanted for him. It might even be seen as a lighter punishment than others. Historians tell us that this practice was not uncommon across various medieval legal systems, from Germanic laws to some interpretations of church law. It was rooted in a deeply patriarchal social structure, where women's value was often tied to their marital status and their ability to produce legitimate heirs. A woman who was sexually assaulted was seen as having lost her value in the marriage market, and the forced marriage was a pragmatic attempt to restore that value, however brutally. Consider the psychological torment Elara would endure. Every day, she would be forced to live with her attacker, to share a bed with him, to potentially bear his children. This was not a pathway to healing or justice. It was a continuation of her trauma, a constant reminder of the violence inflicted upon her. Her home, which should have been a place of safety, would become a prison, haunted by the specter of her assault. Her children, if she had any with him, would forever be tied to this traumatic beginning. This redress was a chilling example of how the legal system in 940 apromatized societal norms and male-centric concerns over the profound personal rights and well-being of women. It served to erase the public stain of the assault by forcing a domestic arrangement rather than truly holding the perpetrator accountable for his crime against an individual. For Elara and countless women like her, this outcome was arguably another form of injustice, a lifelong sentence disguised as a solution. Number 6. Social status nicked its justice. Elara's journey through the 10th century legal system revealed another profound injustice: the principle that social status often dictated the outcome of a case, particularly in matters of sexual assault. In 940, a society was rigidly stratified, from powerful lords and their vassals to free peasants and down to serfs and enslaved people. The laws, while ostensibly applying to all, were interpreted and enforced with a keen awareness of one's place in this hierarchy. The legal system was not blind to social standing. It was profoundly shaped by it. Imagine Elara's frustration if her assailant Hrothgar happened to be a man of higher status, perhaps a lesser noble, a well-connected freeman with land, or even a knight in the service of the local lord. If Hrothgar held more power, commanded more respect, or possessed greater wealth than Elara's family, the path to justice would become exponentially steeper, perhaps even impossible. The wergild or compensation payment, for example, could vary wildly. While a peasant assaulting a peasant might result in a specific fine or punishment, a noble assaulting a peasant woman might incur a much lighter penalty, or even no penalty at all, simply because of his superior status and influence. Conversely, if Elara's family was of low status, perhaps serfs bound to the land, their ability to even bring a case would be severely curtailed. They might not have the ear of the lord, or the means to navigate the complex social dynamics required to gain a hearing. Their lord might view the incident as a minor disturbance among his property, rather than a serious crime deserving of his full attention. The life of a serf woman held less wergild value, less social capital, and thus her assault might be treated with a dismissive indifference that a noblewoman's would never receive. Historians detail how medieval legal codes often included provisions that explicitly differentiated punishments based on social rank. For instance, damaging a nobleman's honor or property carried a far heavier penalty than doing the same to a commoner. This extended to crimes against women. A sexual assault against a noblewoman was a grave affront, a challenge to the power and purity of a powerful lineage, and would likely be met with severe retribution, often aimed at the assailant's life or property. The same act against a peasant woman was often viewed as a less significant transgression, perhaps warranting a smaller fine, if any, paid to her lord, or even just a private settlement that left her with no real justice. Consider the stark contrast. If Elara had been the daughter of a powerful count, her assailant would have faced the full wrath of the nobility. There would have been a strong emphasis on restoring the count's honor, perhaps through public punishment, forced marriage to a lower status assailant, or even swift execution. The power dynamics would have been reversed. But because Elara was a simple village girl, her worth in the eyes of the law was diminished, making her more vulnerable to injustice. This disparity in justice was not just about the formal legal rules, but also about the informal power structures. A wealthy or influential man could bribe officials, intimidate witnesses, or simply use his social connections to ensure the case never truly saw the light of day, or that he received a lenient sentence. Conversely, a family of low status, lacking powerful allies, would struggle to even get their grievance heard, let alone achieve a favorable outcome. Their access to justice was contingent upon the whims of their lord and the prevailing social order, which inherently favored the powerful. For Elara, this meant that even if her claim was undeniably true, the identity and status of her attacker and her own humble background cast a long shadow over her pursuit of justice. The very foundation of the legal system was biased. creating a pervasive sense of unfairness, where one's birthright and social connections weighed more heavily than the truth of the crime itself. It was a stark reminder that in 940, justice was far from blind. It carefully observed and responded to the hierarchies of power. Number 7. The unattainable burden of proof. Let's return to Elara's agonizing quest for justice in 940 ad Brut. Even if she surmounted the hurdles of character scrutiny, the property-centric view of the crime, her lack of independent legal standing, the arbitrariness of ordeals, and the biases of social status, she would still face perhaps the most insurmountable obstacle, the burden of proof. In a world devoid of modern forensic science, where official records were scarce and where judicial processes were rudimentary, proving a crime like sexual assault was incredibly difficult, almost to the point of impossibility, for the victim. Imagine Elara, trembling, trying to recount the events of that terrible evening. The assault occurred in the fading light, in a secluded spot, with no witnesses. There were no immediate medical examinations that could definitively prove non-consensual contact. There were no established investigative bodies like police forces to gather evidence, interview witnesses systematically, or piece together clues. The legal system relied heavily on direct testimony, public accusation, and sometimes immediate physical evidence that was visible to the community. For Elara, the absence of witnesses was a crushing blow. If she could not produce someone who had seen the attack or heard her cries, her accusation often became a he said, she said situation. In such circumstances, the word of a man, especially one with good standing in the community, often carried more weight than the word of a woman. Without corroborating evidence, her claim was vulnerable to being dismissed as unfounded or even as malicious. The very private nature of sexual assault, often committed in isolation, worked against the victim. Furthermore, the legal system might demand immediate and visible signs of struggle or injury. If Elara had not been visibly bruised, or if her injuries were not immediately apparent or severe enough to convince onlookers, her credibility could be doubted. Passage of even a short time could erase subtle evidence, further weakening her case. The expectation was often that a woman would fight fiercely, leaving obvious marks on both herself and her assailant. If such marks were not present, or if her fear had paralyzed her, her account could be dismissed as less than credible. Historians describe how medieval legal systems often lacked the sophistication to deal with crimes that did not leave obvious physical traces or have clear witnesses. The idea of psychological trauma, or the long-term impact of an assault on a woman's mental and emotional state, was not a recognized legal injury. The focus was on tangible, observable facts. The absence of such facts placed an impossible burden on the victim to recreate an event that, by its very nature, often occurred in secret. Consider the immense psychological pressure on Elara. To recount her trauma, to face skeptical eyes, to have her truth questioned simply because there was no outside proof, was an additional layer of pain. She was expected to prove a negative, that she had not consented, that she had fought, that this had truly happened against her will. Without external validation, her internal truth was deemed insufficient. This created a climate where many women, knowing the immense hurdles, might have simply chosen to suffer in silence, enduring the personal agony rather than facing the public humiliation and near impossible task of proving their case. The unattainable burden of proof meant that even if a woman was brave enough to speak out, and even if she was fortunate enough to have a sympathetic male guardian, the very structure of the legal system in 940 had made it incredibly difficult for her to secure justice. It was a system that, while perhaps unintentional, often protected the perpetrators of sexual assault by demanding a level of proof that the nature of the crime itself rarely allowed. For Elara, the weight of this expectation was immense, a final, often decisive barrier to any meaningful form of accountability for the man who had violated her.